10 days before my wedding, I walked away from my future mother-in-law's house thinking I'd forgotten nothing more important than my coat. Looking back, I wish that had been true. My name is Emily Harper. I'm 30 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed I was one of the lucky ones. Ryan Mitchell and I had been together for almost 3 years. We had steady careers, a beautiful apartment in Denver, and a wedding that had taken nearly 12 months to plan. Every invitation had been mailed, every vendor had been paid, and family members had already started flying in from different parts of the country. Whenever people described our relationship, they always used the same words: stable, mature, dependable. I loved hearing those compliments because they matched exactly how I felt. Ryan wasn't overly romantic, but he never gave me a reason to doubt him. He remembered the little things, always showed up when he promised he would, and somehow made every problem feel manageable. I honestly believed I'd found the kind of man people spend years searching for. I had no idea that the person I trusted most was hiding behind the safest version of himself. That Saturday afternoon, Ryan's mother, Diane, invited a handful of close relatives over to finish the last-minute wedding planning. Her house had completely transformed into Command Central. Seating charts covered the dining room table, florist contracts were stacked beside coffee mugs, and fabric samples were spread across the kitchen island. Diane loved being involved in every tiny detail, and while she could be a little controlling, I always brushed it off because Ryan insisted she simply wanted our day to be perfect. The afternoon felt exactly the way you'd expect before a wedding. We laughed over the dessert menu, debated whether the band should take requests, and teased Ryan's uncle for trying to sneak 3 extra guests onto the invitation list. About halfway through the meeting, Ryan arrived from work. He walked straight over, kissed my forehead, squeezed my hand beneath the table, and smiled. "Only 10 more days." I laughed and whispered back, "I know. Ow, I can't wait." If someone had pulled me aside right then and told me that conversation would be the last genuinely happy moment of our relationship, I would have thought they were out of their mind. When everything wrapped up, I hugged Diane goodbye, grabbed my planner, purse, and keys, then headed outside while everyone stayed behind talking. I was halfway down the driveway when the cold November wind hit me. Instinctively, I reached for my coat, but my shoulder was empty. I groaned the second I remembered where I'd left it, hanging over the chair beside the hallway mirror. The front door hadn't latched completely, so I quietly pushed it open, planning to slip inside, grab my coat, and leave without interrupting anyone. I had barely taken 2 steps when I heard my name. My feet stopped moving before I even realized why. Ryan laughed, but it wasn't the warm laugh I knew. It sounded lighter, almost relieved. Then I heard him say, "Honestly, marrying Emily solves more problems than people realize." For a second, nobody spoke. Then Diane answered with a laugh of her own. "Just make sure she never finds out why you really proposed." The room erupted with quiet amusement, but I couldn't hear the rest. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned everything else out. Every instinct told me to grab my coat and leave. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, because deep down, I knew the next few words were about to decide whether I still had a wedding or whether the last 3 years of my life had been built on a lie. I stayed exactly where I was, barely breathing as the conversation continued. Someone at the table laughed before asking, "So, does she actually think you proposed because you're crazy about her?" My stomach tightened. Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a quiet chuckle I'd never heard before. "Emily believes what she sees," he said. "I've always been consistent with her. That's all she's ever needed." Another round of laughter followed. Diane spoke next, her voice calm and almost proud. "Consistency builds trust. Trust keeps people from asking difficult questions." My chest felt so tight I thought I might pass out. They weren't talking about me like I was family. They weren't even talking about me like I was a person. I sounded like a strategy they'd spent months perfecting. Before anyone could continue, I quietly backed away from the hallway, slipped out the front door, and drove home without my coat. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just drove in complete silence, replaying every word until they no longer sounded like a misunderstanding. They sounded intentional. That night, Ryan called me like nothing had happened. He asked whether I'd made it home safely, joked about his uncle trying to change the seating chart again, and reminded me not to forget our final meeting with the florist on Monday. His voice was warm, familiar, almost comforting. If I hadn't overheard that conversation, I never would have questioned a single word he said. More than once, I almost confronted him. I wanted to ask why his mother had said I could never know the real reason he proposed. But every time I picked up my phone, I stopped myself. If Ryan had been hiding something for this long, he wasn't going to confess because I asked one uncomfortable question. I needed answers, not excuses. So instead of accusing him, I started watching him more carefully than I ever had before. For the first time in our relationship, I stopped seeing him as the man I loved and started seeing him as someone whose actions needed to match his words. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, we met with our wedding planner for one final walkthrough at the venue. Everything looked beautiful, but Ryan barely noticed. While I discussed flower placement and ceremony timing, he spent nearly 20 minutes in the hallway talking on his phone. When he came back, he apologized and casually said it was a call from work. I nodded, pretending to believe him. Minutes later, he walked away again after his phone buzzed. This time, he left it face up on the table beside me. I wasn't trying to invade his privacy, but the screen lit up before I could look away. A message from someone named Mark flashed across the display. Did your mom finally get rid of the last reminder of Claire? Before I could even process the message, another one appeared. Just make sure Emily never learns why Claire really left. My pulse stopped. Claire? Ryan had only mentioned her once during our entire relationship. According to him, she was simply an ex who wanted different things in life. Nothing more. Nothing worth talking about. But if that were true, why was his best friend bringing her up 4 days before our wedding? I found Claire's profile in less than 10 minutes. She still lived in Denver, worked as an interior designer, and judging by her photos, she'd rebuilt a life that looked peaceful. I stared at the message button for what felt like forever before finally typing, "Hi, my name is Emily. I'm engaged to Ryan Mitchell. I know this message probably sounds strange, but I think we need to talk." I almost deleted it. Instead, I hit send. I expected silence, or maybe a polite response telling me I'd contacted the wrong person. Instead, less than 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Claire's reply contained only one sentence. "If you're marrying Ryan this Saturday, please don't make any decisions until you've spoken to me." My heart dropped. We agreed to meet the following afternoon at a quiet coffee shop across town. The moment she walked through the door, I noticed something unexpected. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She looked worried. After introducing herself, she studied my face for a few seconds before quietly asking, "Has Ryan ever told you why we actually broke up?" I shook my head. "He said you wanted different things." Claire smiled sadly. "That's the version he tells everyone." For the next hour, Claire filled in 3 years of missing pieces. She told me Ryan wasn't cruel or abusive. In fact, that was what made him so difficult to understand. He always looked like the perfect partner from the outside. He remembered anniversaries, paid bills on time, planned vacations months in advance, and never raised his voice during arguments. But whenever emotions entered the conversation, he treated them like problems that needed efficient solutions. When Claire's father became seriously ill, and she wanted to move closer to her family, Ryan refused because it didn't fit the financial plan he'd mapped out for their future. When she asked whether he was still happy with her, he didn't answer by saying he loved her. Instead, he handed her a list of reasons their relationship still made sense. Claire looked directly at me before saying something that sent chills down my spine. Living with Ryan felt less like being loved and more like being interviewed for a position he'd already decided to fill. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out an old folder she'd kept for years. Inside was a letter Ryan had written after their breakup. Most of it was ordinary, until my eyes landed on one sentence highlighted in yellow. Love changes with time. Stability is the only thing that lasts. Suddenly, Diane's words made perfect sense. This wasn't advice she'd recently given her son. It was a philosophy they'd believed for years. I left the coffee shop feeling like I was carrying someone else's life. Everything I'd believed about my relationship suddenly looked different. Ryan hadn't chosen me because I was the love of his life. He'd chosen me because I fit the future he'd already planned. I drove home and found my wedding dress hanging in the bedroom exactly where I'd left it after the final fitting. Just 2 days earlier, I'd looked at that dress and imagined walking toward the happiest moment of my life. Now it felt like a costume for a role I refused to play. That evening, Ryan called to ask whether I preferred the seafood entree or the steak option for the reception dinner. I listened to him talk about menu choices while wondering if he'd ever once asked himself whether I actually felt loved. Before hanging up, he smiled and said, "Only 3 more days, and everything we've worked for finally comes together." Ether. I looked at the engagement ring on my hand and quietly replied, "You're right. Everything is about to change." He thought I was talking about our wedding. I already knew I was talking about its ending. By the morning of the ceremony, I'd made my decision. Ryan thought he was about to marry the safest choice of his life. What he didn't know was that I'd prepared one final conversation, and there would be no wedding after it. The morning of the wedding arrived exactly the way I'd imagined for almost a year. Clear skies, fresh flowers, and smiling faces everywhere I looked. My bridesmaids laughed while helping me into my dress. Photographers moved around the bridal suite, capturing what everyone believed were happy memories. And my mother couldn't stop crying every time she looked at me. "You look beautiful," she whispered as she adjusted my veil one last time. I forced a smile because I couldn't bring myself to ruin that moment for her. 10 days earlier, when Ryan had whispered, "Only 10 more days," I'd thought we were counting down to the beginning of our forever. Standing there in front of the mirror, I finally understood the truth. I hadn't been counting down to my wedding. I'd been counting down to the day I finally saw the man I was about to marry for who he really was. 20 minutes before the ceremony, I asked my maid of honor to send Ryan to the small conference room beside the bridal suite. I told everyone I wanted one private moment together before we exchanged vows. No one questioned it. They all smiled, believing they were about to witness one last romantic conversation. Ryan walked into the room wearing the tuxedo we'd chosen together. The moment he saw me, he smiled. "You look incredible," he said as he reached for my hands. I quietly stepped back. His smile disappeared almost immediately. Before he could ask what was wrong, I placed a large envelope on the table between us. Inside were printed screenshots of the messages from Mark, a copy of the letter Claire had shown me, and a single sheet of paper where I'd written every sentence I'd overheard at Diane's house. Ryan looked through the pages without saying a word. When he finally looked up, he didn't deny any of it. Instead, he sighed and said, "Emily, you don't understand the context." I shook my head. "Then explain it." He hesitated before answering. "I was trying to build us a secure future." I couldn't help but smile, but it wasn't from happiness. "Do you know what hurts the most?" I asked quietly. Not once have you said you proposed because you loved me." The room fell completely silent. A few seconds later, the door opened and Diane stepped inside after realizing something was wrong. The moment she saw the papers, she looked at Ryan instead of me. "I told you this conversation would come back one day," she said under her breath. That was all I needed to hear. She hadn't denied it either. I removed my engagement ring and placed it on top of the envelope. "I'm not canceling this wedding because you lied," I said calmly. "I'm canceling it because you never chose me. You chose the life you thought I could give you." Ryan finally took a step toward me, but I raised my hand before he could speak. "You once told me I made life feel easy. I thought that was love. Now I realize I was just convenient." For the first time since we'd met, he had no answer. Minutes later, our families gathered outside the room after hearing raised voices. My father looked confused. My mother looked terrified. Ryan's relatives stared at us, waiting for someone to explain why the ceremony hadn't started. I walked over to my parents, took a deep breath, and said, "I'm so sorry, but I can't marry someone who sees commitment as a calculation instead of a choice." My mother wrapped her arms around me without asking another question. My father looked at Ryan for a long moment before quietly saying, "Then there's nothing else to discuss." We walked out together, leaving behind the flowers, the music, and every plan we'd spent a year creating. 6 months later, I was cleaning out my hallway closet when I found the same winter coat I'd gone back for that afternoon at Diane's house. I held it in my hands and laughed to myself. Funny how I'd spent weeks believing that coat was the one thing I'd almost left behind. The truth was, it wasn't my coat that had been waiting for me inside that house. It was my self-respect. Losing a wedding was painful. Losing deposits, explaining everything to family, and starting over wasn't easy. But none of it compared to the life I would have lived if I'd ignored what I'd heard that day. Sometimes people think the bravest thing you can do is walk down the aisle. In my case, the bravest thing I ever did was walk away before I reached it.